Nod your heads. You can hear me? New Zealand? Auckland, can you hear me? I'm trying to... Okay, so if you can hear me, just nod your heads. Okay, you're good? Okay, good. Thanks very much. Well, first of all, I'm Dale Eisler, and I'm a Senior Policy Fellow here at the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy in Regina, Saskatchewan, at the University of Regina. And I want to welcome everybody here in the room, our presenters today, and all the folks at 4 different locations. So maybe if I could, and hopefully the technology is going to work, let's hope. Looks like it's all operational. Maybe I could start by introducing the moderators from the other locations. So from the University of Saskatchewan, Jen Budney. Jen, are you there? There's Jen. Hello? Can everybody see Jen? Good, okay. And our moderator at UBC is Sue Forwell. Sue? There's Sue. Hi, Sue. At Western Ontario, Lynn Shaw. Lynn? There's Lynn. Good. We're connecting here. And finally, at Auckland University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, Claire Hawking. Claire? Hello, Claire. So welcome, everybody. And through the miracle of technology, we're connected across Canada and around the globe. So that's good. So the subject that we're going to be discussing today is the power of meaning in organizations. And I have to admit, when I first saw it, I thought, no, wait, the words have been transposed. It should be the meaning of power in organizations. I guess those are 2 different subjects, obviously. But no, we're going to be talking about the power of meaning in organizations, looking at the individual in terms of what they draw from their work and the meaning that it gives them as an individual in terms of their career and their attachment to the organization. And to sort of lead us in this discussion, we've got 2 experts in this field. They're sitting here. Hopefully you can see people on the screen. I should get out of the way. Near me here to my right is Ken Ludwig. He's Executive Director of Organizational Effectiveness for the Public Service Commission of Saskatchewan. And to Ken's right is Reg Urbanowski. Reg is Special Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Advanced Education here in Saskatchewan. And both Ken and Reg are experts in the field of occupational science or organizational development, and they're going to kind of set out context for us today in terms of their presentation and areas for us to consider, and then we'll have a discussion after that. So let me kind of turn it over to Ken and Reg, and hopefully the technology will work. We have it on the screen. I'll get out of the way, and you guys can run through your presentation, and then we'll have a discussion, bringing in all the other locations and people here in the room in Regina for a bit of a guided discussion after that. So over to you, fellas.
Great. Thank you, Dale. Maybe just a sort of a bit of an intro to this, just to let you know that this started off about a year ago, Ken and I having coffee and realizing that when he talked about organizational development and I talked about occupational science, it was like 2 languages that nobody really understood what the other person was saying. And over the course of the year, we began to talk about some of the things that were in common, and we realized that this was kind of all circling around this notion of the power of meaning in organizations. Whether it was talking about the personal or private value that people attach to it, or talking about the public value that people have when they talk about meaning in organizations, or when we talk about culture and those kinds of things. So today, I think we just want to share some of those ideas with you. Some of our concepts that we've come up with, and it really is just sort of a brief review, and try to end on a point where there's some practicality for it so that we can have a meaningful discussion afterwards. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, so in terms of purposes, we really have 2 purposes today. One is to explore the potential in finding the place for personal meaning in the workplace, but also to demonstrate how 2 disciplines, in this case organizational development and occupational science, can come together to create something new. And so with all good discussions, we start with a question.
And that question, first of all, is why do people work? Other than the point of making money and going up that Maslowian kind of pyramid, we began to look at the literature on why people work, and we're really more interested in the intrinsic values that were attached to that. And that's what brought us into this whole issue of meaning. And the more that we read about the meaning stuff, the more we began to realize that, people attach meaning to things by what they do. It's what they do in their job that's what's important to them. So we thought maybe there's more here.
Yeah. Yep. So why does this question matter? Why does it matter why people work beyond the means to provide for themselves? Well, it matters because we actually have a fairly concerning situation when it comes to lack of employee engagement from the workplace. Gallup in 2011 reported that 71% of American workers were either not engaged or actively disengaged. In their State of the Global Workforce study 2013, where they took that data into 2012, they report that they're still reporting that 70% of American workers are either not engaged or actively disengaged. 84% of Canadian workers are either not engaged or actively disengaged. And in New Zealand, 77% of workers are either not engaged or actively disengaged. Given that we're some time out of the economic crisis of 2008 and we're not seeing those levels of engagement rise in any significant way, it becomes concerning. Aon Hewitt and Connexa Institute, both in studies in 2011, confirmed that 2011 marked a low point in employee engagement, and Hay Group studies in 2013 confirmed that flat trend of employee engagement was extending into 2013. So people tend to be disconnected from their work.
And Ken, looking at some of this data, what I thought was interesting was that when we were looking at this and we began to talk about how do people actually actively disengage, what does that mean to actively disengage from your job? It's not just about the work that you're assigned. It's about the water cooler talk, the conversations that you have with people. What happens to that part? What happens to the social, cultural kinds of things that we talk about when people actively disengage from work? Because we see that on the rise. And so we began to look at that a little more.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah. And so when we looked at the challenges that we were interested in, we were looking at how do you get to a point of disengagement to fully engaging people again. And it was probably around this idea that we actually had to change the way people not only did their work, because maybe there is some of that, but how do they actually sort of live at work, if you want to put it that way, sort of the whole thing that they're doing in there. So we needed to look at these intrinsic motivators a little more and talk about what people are experiencing regardless of whether they're in some form of job that's on a production line or whether they're on some other kind of senior CEO position. It's about understanding the experience that they have on a day-to-day basis.
So where can we look for answers on what we can do different to re-engage people? Well, we have two disciplines to draw from. From the world of organizational development, there's been a lot of work by practitioners and research on purpose and meaning in organization. Now there's a whole raft of literature out there, but by way of some examples, Peter Senge in his 1990 Fifth Discipline talks about, he lists personal mastery or finding personal meaning as a core discipline in an effective learning organization. Jim Collins in Good to Great in 2011 talks about the need for organizations to have a clear sense of purpose so that they can produce meaning for their workforce. And Margaret Wheatley, Finding Our Way, 2005, counsels leaders to keep meaning at the forefront of their practices. Also from the world of organizational development, a lot of practitioner work and research around employee empowerment or participative leadership. Blanchard and Hersey did a lot of work back decades ago now in it. But in a more recent study, Wagner and Harder in 2006 actually proved out the link between empowerment of employees and the connection to their engagement. And so the world of organizational development has one contribution to make.
When we looked at occupational science, for those of you that aren't familiar with that area, the term occupation is much broader than the world of work. The term occupation is all about goal-directed activities. So it's everything that we do in the day. And when we talk about the work day, it's all of those goal-directed activities that you would do. It could be the water cooler talk, just as much as the lunch hour, just as much as as it is the actual work activities that you do. Occupational science, as an interdisciplinary science, looks at people as occupational beings, meaning what we do during the day helps form an integral part of who we are. It's about doing, being, and becoming, as Yerxa would talk about, or talking about occupation as being essential for health and well-being, as in Schenk and Kutchin. Talk about a concept called occupational performance, meaning what you do with those activities. It's engagement in purposeful activities. And that's where we started to bridge the two, is this concept of engagement.
So when we started to weave those thoughts together, we realized that from these two disciplines, when we start weaving the thoughts together, we're really talking about the same thing, and it can get us to a new place. If we focus on the idea of personal meaning in the workplace, at work and in organizations.
And when we talk about meaning in an occupational science, think about what people do, how meaning is attached to what people do. Because that's the essence, I think, of what we're talking about here. That there's really three, I'm going to say four ways. Three of those ways are what Griffiths talks about. One is that you can have participation in occupations that have meaningful characteristics to them. So you're participating in activities that are meaningful. The other is that you're doing things that involve social relationships that have meaningful characteristics about them. The third is some kind of a transcendence kind of experience that you have. But we're also going to suggest a fourth here that we're going to talk later on, that sometimes understanding what people do in context, in the ecosystem, what I do at work, it's very much interrelated to what everybody else does. How I interact at the water cooler, how I design a briefing note, how I shovel snow, it's all related to the ecosystem that I'm in. Does that make sense?
So before we go any further, we need to clarify a few terms. From the perspective of organizational development, when we talk about engagement, we're really talking about the extent to which people are satisfied by and committed to their work and their organization. This definition comes from a review of the research done about 2005 by an interjurisdictional team. And also from the OD perspective, when we talk about culture, I like the words that Daryl Connor has put around it in Managing at the Speed of Change. The frame of reference that distinguishes one group of people from another. It's an organizational self-concept that's analogous to personality. And it really is a complex of shared beliefs, assumptions, values, and behaviors. So when I'm using that kind of language, this is what I'm going to be referring to.
It's very close, I think, when we talk about the concept of engagement, about the subjective experience of what people do. And so in occupational science, we're looking at three terms here. One is occupation, that I've kind of already talked about as being a synthesis of doing, being, and becoming. But then there's the engagement piece that we talked about. And in the organizational development literature, there's a certain perspective on it. In the occupational science literature, it's about the subjective experience of doing. And this ecosystem, which is really the interface between the activities that you do, how that relates to everything outside, because you're doing something to relate to your environment.
And the ecosystem language also resonates back with a particular stream of thought in organizational development that likes to view organizations as organic systems. So there is a there is a resonance in that language.
So one of the things that Person and Erlandson talk about is issue of meaning and meaningfulness. And they talk about when we do things, when we carry out these goal-directed activities, they're viewed as meaningful if they have concrete, symbolic, and self-renewal value. The issue of self-renewal value is an interesting term because it talks about how carrying out the activity more than once, perhaps repetitive, or in different kinds of contexts, how does it maintain and shape its value? Really, when we talk about work and people carrying out work activities, that's sort of at the pivot of this. And it's maybe, we got into the discussion, I think Ken and I later on, about habituation and routinization of work, and how sometimes that kind of dulls. People see having a loss of sense of meaning because they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. Well, maybe what's happened is that renewal, that self-renewal value is gone. So we began to think about, well, how do you begin to work that in again?
We're going to talk a bit about calling as well. And when we're not equating calling with vocation, they're different things, but we are suggesting that calling equates to a sense, an internal sense of vocation. Now, when Duffy and Dick did research of the literature on calling just last year, they found that thinking beyond the religious context, there's no common definition of calling, but it tends to contain three elements. One is an external summons to action, something pulling us outside of ourselves. Secondly, a meaning or purpose. It's that something has personal significance, relates to our personal sense of meaning, and a pro-social motivation, an orientation towards a contribution of some kind. So this is the commonalities in the understanding of calling or sense of vocation. So as Reg and I were discussing this, we found that there was common ground in, if we look at an essential linkage. That essential linkage starts with personal meaning. A personal meaning is a complex that consists of identity, that persistent self-reference or self-concept that we carry, what we might call soul, our sense of connection to a larger reality, and also our sense of the purposiveness of life in general and our lives in particular. Now, orbiting very closely around that complex are our core beliefs and our core values. And this package really makes up our personal meaning.
So Adams talks about the career counseling, and talks about career counseling in the sense that maybe what we need to do to help people to engage fully in the workplace is to assist people in finding a fuller meaning in life. And the article takes Steger's approach to the essential aspects of meaning as being two things. First of all, purpose. Having a purpose for what you're doing, those activities being purposeful activities. And the second piece on there is the significance. And the significance is where we get tied into things like job descriptions, things like talking about organizational culture, things about HR practices like job carving, that kind of stuff. So you can see now how meaning in organizational development and occupational science begin to weave themselves into actual practices in the workplace that are there. And we talked about the engagement with work and contribution to the community. It goes back to this issue of what is the perceived value contribution. It's not necessarily about only a public value or a private value, but it's actually a combination of both.
So as personal meaning is experienced in a calling or a sense of vocation, and that's applied in engagement with some work which produces some value, that value created and the recognition of that value created actually reinforces it reinforces in turn the self-worth that's going to be associated with that personal meaning. And this linkage is not in isolation.
We talked about this ecosystem, and the ecosystem, put it into practical terms. When we talk about somebody having a job with certain kinds of activities or duties that they perform, very rarely is it in isolation. It's never in isolation, because there's always an ecosystem that goes on within the person's life. Why am I doing what I'm doing? But there's also how it relates to the other jobs that people are doing. How does my work impact other jobs? But it's also about what's my relationship to my coworkers? What's the water cooler talk? How am I feeling today when I left home, and how do I come to work? That's that whole ecosystem thing that we bring into us. And someplace in here, when we talk about that system, isn't it about, when we talk about personal meaning, that sometimes can we adapt, let me just say adapt the activities that we do, the occupations that we do, and I'll use the term occupational diversity here, to simply mean there are times when I want to go to work that I will want to engage with people because I'm in that kind of frame of mind. There are times when I'll go to work and I won't want to engage with people. That's what I call occupational diversity. It's not just about changing my job, it's just changing about how I am every day. Or that you restrict that. In this kind of model that we're thinking of, the more difficult it becomes for people to have meaningful engagement. And I think we need to sort of talk, I suppose, about common meaning that we have in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I thought you were going to talk about that.
Oh, there we go. So this particular slide here we drew up because we realize that in a workplace where people are together, that it isn't just about everybody going around automated self-actualizing people, that there is actually an interplay that goes on between them and the organization, but there's an interplay between people as well. You know what happens on a daily basis? That meaning gets mediated, it changes, it fluctuates. And it occurs on a micro level at my workplace. But we also try to impact it as organizational leaders by creating things like strategic planning. Because strategic planning is really about how do you mediate people's classic paradigms. Because if I was to engage everybody in this room and in all the other sites into a strategic planning exercise, isn't it about coming to a common term, a common definition, a common cause of action of where we're going to go? If that's the case, it's really about negotiating meaning.
So personal meaning and common meaning inform each other, mediate each other. But given the concerning levels of disengagement, people from their workplace, we can question how well that personal meaning and common meaning are relating to each other. How well personal meaning and the overall direction, strategic direction of an organization are actually talking to each other. How well people's sense of vocation and the business that an organization is engaged in are actually talking to each other and informing each other.
And I think when you decouple those occupations that people do in their work, the meaning they attach to them, with sort of the collective expectations of people, the organization. This is what your job is, this is what you're expected to do, and this is how you're expected to be productive, and this is how we'll measure you, versus this is what I believe my job to be, this is how I want to relate to people at my work. The more you disengage that, the more risk you are of having people lose a sense of meaning in their job.
So how can we bring it together? How can we bring personal meaning and the strategic direction of an organization together through some kind of compelling vision, some kind of common sense of common purpose? How can we bring people's sense of vocation and the business that an organization is engaged in together through some common understanding of the meaningfulness of the work?
And so part of that, this diagram here, is to show how if you can create a process where people can actually feel and actually be involved in creating a common vision, as opposed to, and this kind of goes counter a little bit to some more traditional models of visioning, as an example, where it's sort of laid down, here's a vision, and we can buy into, here's the cultural values that we aspire to. This actually talks about bringing it up as opposed to bringing it down. You follow what I'm saying?
And possibly put some heart and soul back in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. And I think in there, just to, before we leave that, this is where, when you talk about things like quality improvement, you talk about the plan, do, reflect, you talk about strategic planning, all of those other kinds of initiatives are a way to try to manage this. Where you can actually re-engage people is to ensure that there's a clear line of sight people have between Why am I here? What does the organization expect from me?
Yeah, actually, maybe I'll share that story now.
Okay.
When we talk about line of sight as it relates to meaning, it evokes a story that you may be familiar with of a man who came upon 3 stonecutters in a quarry. Has anyone ever come across that story? The man asked the first stonecutter what he was doing, and he said, "I'm cutting this stupid stone." And the man asked the second stonecutter what he was doing, and he said, "I'm shaping this stone nice and square and smooth and a certain size so that the builder can fit it neatly into a straight wall." And the man asked the third stonecutter what he was doing, and the stonecutter turned and said, "I'm building a cathedral." That's the difference in line of sight when it comes to meaning of work.
So it brings us to a point where we began to think about, well, what does this actually mean on the ground? I mean, what are some of the practical applications of this? And so when we think about some of the approaches and practices to engage people, we begin to look for just sort of some of the key words that exist there in the literature about how to engage people. And you'll hear words like, gee, there needs to be some advocacy. Somebody needs to talk on behalf of people to bring that meaning back. There needs to be coaching. There needs to be collaboration, consultation, or educating, or coordinating. All of those terms. You know what's interesting with all of those terms from where I sit, if you look at the definitions of them? They're all about helping people renegotiate a meaningful place in their workplace. They're all about sort of bringing that alignment between the organization's notion of meaning and the individual's notion of meaning closer together. So it's about reframing, helping people to reframe, and you do that in part by helping them to understand that ecosystem that they're immersed in.
So let's look at some on-the-ground practices that can help to make that real. It probably starts with leaders championing the building of organizational vision and direction in a way that allows for real participation in the building of common meaning. Not just the meetings to put some words together for a mission statement, not the cascading down, but real dialogue to build common meaning around what the organization is about, where it's going, what it's working to achieve, and making that participation very real.
So if I looked at some of the processes that we might engage in organizations, for instance, enterprise risk management, being one of those practices, tends to be very much devoid of personal meaning, because what happens in that process is you assign a risk that something has to the organization. Could you enhance ERM and the effectiveness of ERM by engaging people to understand what is the implications for them, not just to the organization, for them as well? Because I do think that if you had that aligning, you would end up in an ERM process that people are more likely to buy into.
It's about working on that line of sight and making that line of sight real for people. And it can start really with orientation. Our traditional approaches to orientation have been really to talk to new people, to socialize and condition them, not to engage in the personal meaning that they're bringing with them, and to find out where the point of intersection is, and to start the process of them adding their personal meaning to the dialogue going on in the organization. We tell at our orientation, we could be dialoguing in our orientation.
And when you look at something as I won't say it's banal, but perhaps as structured as a job description tends to be sometimes, it is an attempt to try to codify meaning. I mean, because the way that the job descriptions are typically laid out simply means this is what we've arrived at. So when you sign on to this job, these are your expectations. This is what you're expected to do.
Now, W.L. Gore, the company that we know most prominently for Gore-Tex, has had an innovative onboarding process in place for decades now. When a manager in an area realizes that more capacity, more workforce capacity is needed, they hire people into that area. But the new person into the area is given an opportunity to spend some time, usually about a week, just surveying that area and finding where they're drawn to make a contribution. They then sit down with the manager of that area and together craft a job description that reflects where that individual that's new to the workforce has found that they're being called to add to the efforts going on there. Quite innovative, and it really results in people being engaged right up front with the workplace that they've come into, rather than being told what their duties are.
This flows right into the next slide, which talks about how to work with teams as opposed to signing work, making sure that we go through not just talking about shared values, but shared meaning and what it means to work in a workplace. Because in essence, if you look at all the cultural work that's done in organizations, the true culture of the organization is on the floor. And it's to grab that culture and understand that culture and to work with it, as opposed to perhaps a top-down approach, which is to show leadership by imposing a set of values and cultural meanings. That relates somewhat to the issue of bringing together the public and the private value, people assigned to certain things in their job and what they do. And it's important to go back to that sentence again: assign public and private value, what people do. That's their occupations, and that's how they define themselves. And that top point that's there about championing and supporting meaningful career planning is really all about when people come in and they will have a certain sense of where they want to go in their job, because they have a belief based on what they know, whether it's through a job advertisement or through reading a job description or an orientation program, that they've been able to assign some meaning to the things that they're going to do. But that's not static. That will always change. As people come and go in their workplace around them, in their primary ecosystem, as people come and go, their nature of their work will go. The more they become familiar with the tasks that they do, the more that will change as well.
Another area we might examine is our approach to recognition, and maybe appreciate the power of recognition when it's not focused solely on the product of our work. You know, that's a good result, but when it also focuses on the personal meaning that's being expressed in the work, because that's going to affirm people's sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. That's going to nourish their self-worth. That's going to nourish their passion for their work. When we're not just commenting in our recognition on the product of their work, but we're actually affirming the personal meaning that's being expressed in it. Just adds more power to that recognition. And when it came to what we traditionally call disability management, Reg and I really chafed at traditional approaches when we think about meaning.
So I think one of the first things that we had an issue with, and we just chose this because I think it was a common area of interest for us, the concept of disability management as a term was difficult for us because it's devoid of any meaning whatsoever. It's about managing a disability. And so we needed to look for something else and move away from a deficit approach, because a deficit approach is not based on what people can do, much as what people can't do. And while that may seem to be a semantic difference, it does reflect a difference in the way that you would approach it. So if I took one of the common things in disability management programs is to talk about job carding. So if we had a particular job that somebody was doing, we had somebody with a disability coming in, could you carve out part of that job so that someone with a disability would be able to do that job? How you conventionally would do that is according to competency. So you would assess the competency of the person with the disability, and then you would look at the competencies required of that particular part of the job, carve that off, and give that to the person. The difficulty with that is that sees a person as a one-dimensional individual. They're strictly someone who can come in and do competency-based tasks. Nobody is at their workplace simply for that. There's a social atmosphere to it. There's no growth necessarily attached to that. So maybe what we need to do with job carving is to realign ourselves and understand what's meaningful for that individual with the disability, but also what remains meaningful in that job and in that ecosystem for the person without the disability.
So if these are some of the things that organizations can do to foster or build meaning, what might we be doing that is actually killing meaning and maybe contributing to our disengagement? Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer in 2011 published a book where they talked about some of the common traps that leaders are getting into that they've found which kill meaning. The first trap that they refer to is mediocrity signals. What they mean here is that organizations may have aspirational goals, but other messages that are delivered to staff trump those aspirations. For instance, in a preoccupation with cost savings, dictated reduction goals actually kill aspirational priorities and a sense of ownership for those aspirations. And likewise, risk aversion in practice by leaders communicates to employees that real progress on the organization's part is not really desired. So it results in mediocrity signals, which kill people's sense of meaning. Another trap that Amabile and Kramer refer to, they call strategic attention deficit disorder. By this they mean that frequent strategic shifts or directional shifts, goals, priorities, plans changing too often and not being seen through, make it difficult for employees to maintain a stable sense of purpose and have something to connect onto. If next week there's a new priority list, I have a hard time attaching my sense of meaning to anything. Third thing they talk about is corporate keystone cops. And here they're talking about leaders' neglect to address miscoordination or active contribution to miscoordination through things like overly complex reporting structures, failure to hold functions accountable, or chronic indecisiveness that leads to rushed analysis and rushed planning. These things lead people to stop believing that they can accomplish anything. And so it starts to kill people's sense of meaning at their work. And finally, misbegotten, big, hairy, audacious goals. Lofty goals that are too grandiose, that have little relevance for people in the trenches, and leave a meaning vacuum for people. So this, through their study, is what they found as being the common ways that we're killing meaning at work.
They also go on to talk about how to avoid falling into those particular traps, and we've picked three of the ones that we felt were most salient to our conversation today. And the first one talks about strategic clarity, and what's important in that first bullet is first of all, the concept of strategic clarity. And strategic clarity refers to everybody should see what it is you're trying to do and why you're doing it. If that's not there, then you've lost that integration of collective and personal meaning, that mediated meaning that we talk about, and how that carries on in what people do in their everyday lives, right? So strategic clarity is critical. But then they also go on to talk about strategic clarity that is consistent with the organization's capabilities and an understanding of where it can add the most value. So there has to be something within the organization that has that capacity to carry that forward. There's nothing worse than having strategic clarity with an organization that will never reach that point of what you've said. People can see where you want to go, but you haven't actually resourced, you haven't actually planned it out carefully. The second point is keeping sight of the individual employee's perspective. And that's to create the employee supervision models, the employee involvement models, and the individual assessment models, to the point where the individual can always see that clear line of sight between what they're doing, what their position is in the workplace, what it is that the organization sets out to achieve. And the third one is about these early warning systems. And what they mean by that, I think, is what do we create in our organization that says, you know what, this isn't working? And how do you prevent some of that disengagement that Ken talked about in the beginning? There are warning signs along the way. Some of those warning signs relate to what we've been talking about in terms of people losing their sense of meaning. You know when people no longer are engaged in their work. We can talk about that. As we go on to talk about why we explore the meaning, the power of meaning in organizations, for us it's important to continue that dialogue simply because it's about enriching a dialogue, but it's to understand the primacy of meaningful activities in what people do in their daily work. And all their meaningful activities, not focused just on the job duties. Because it's that total person, that total activities that they come with that is actually woven into the fabric of the organization. It's not the individual just doing their job. What holds a unit together as a unit where people want to come to work is usually not the job duties. It's the relationships, it's the atmosphere included into that.
So, why explore the power of meaning in organizations? Or to come back to our first question, why do we do what we do? Viktor Frankl suggested an answer back some decades ago. Our main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but it's to seek meaning in life. And this is where we can find sort of the heart of people engaging with work.
So I'll turn it back to Dale and
Hello? Can people hear me? Is my mic on? Yeah? Okay? Good. Well, listen, thank you very much, Reg and Ken. So now we're going to have a bit of a discussion. I think you guys have framed the subject very well and raised a number of interesting points. I know I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to try to dominate things. So I think we should go to our remote sites if we can and begin the discussion. And I think what I'll do is kind of go sequentially here to try to keep things more or less flowing. Maybe Claire in Auckland, if we could go to you folks in terms of your thoughts on this subject and the sorts of things that Ken and Rich talk about in terms of how do you power meaning within organizations. So I'll just kind of turn it over to you and
we can't see them. We'll just see them to us.
Yeah.
We're actually having trouble hearing you when you're not holding the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Just wanted to turn it over to you, Claire, and your colleagues in terms of your thoughts on the presentations and the subject we're dealing with today. So, just wanted to get your opinions.
One of the things that I was thinking about, that it was a shame we didn't ask our Vice Chancellor to come to the presentation. As the person who creates meaning for us, it feels a very long distance between what we do on a day-to-day basis and the organisation. But I was also thinking about the 3 stoneworkers and for organisations like a university where we don't create the cathedral. We just create the skills in the stonemasons, and it's a step even more removed from the direct line of sight that that story addresses. Because for us, it's about making the stonemasons so that they can make the cathedral, and I'm not. Yeah, that for me just felt like another layer of complexity for us to think about in this kind of work. I don't know if my colleagues want to add any other reflections to throw into the mix.
Yeah, I was wondering about the statement, approaches and practices to engage people in order to build strong workplaces in organisations. So this obviously comes from an organisational perspective. I wonder what it would be like turning that upside down and starting from the meaning of the individual rather than the meaning for the organization. Yeah.
Okay, well, the line of sight I think is a very interesting one, and maybe I could ask Ken and Rich, if I think about this subject in the context of a large bureaucratic structure, i.e. government, for example, to me, I had the sense, on the line of sight sort of point, that there's systemic challenges here, because that's the problem in large organizations, is people cannot have a line of sight to the end product because they don't see it. And it's not as if there's at the end of the day, you see the result of your work, because often in bureaucracies, multiple levels, and if you're at a lower level, it works its way up the chain, and if there is an outcome, it's often very much later, and you don't see yourself in it at all. And that's really a systemic issue. So in those big organizations, how do you deal with that?
It's more of a challenge. It's more of a challenge when you know, in the days when we got into functional specialization in organization. In the days of craft industry, if I built the whole carriage and I turned it over to you to use, I have a very clear line of sight with the product of my labor and the benefits that it's getting. When we get into functional specialization and I'm only making a part of the wheel of that carriage, it's more of a challenge. And there's no simple answer except for the conversation that keeps the whole picture real for people. It's the stonecutter understanding that what they're doing might be a part, but what the whole is that part is feeding into.
If I, to stick with the government example, because it's certainly part of what I know the best. If I take something such like a briefing note to be prepared for a minister, that will often have 5 or 6 levels of approval. And so somebody initially will write a briefing note and it will go up various levels. You're not really sure what's going to happen with it. So I think that's kind of the thing that you're talking about. But it is in the process, not to understand each briefing note in this process, but to understand, why do I write these things in the first place? And it's that discussion that you can have in your work unit. Your work unit is those people that you work with around you. And it's in that process that you realize that if people have been disengaged, they say, I really don't care, I just write it and I send it up. They may not like it, they may not. As opposed to somebody who may write one and actually say to themselves, I'm actually writing this because I need to inform the minister of this particular issue, because I think it's important. And
actually, to expand on that line of sight, I'm actually helping to inform a decision-making process, yep, which can then translate into sound direction.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that you'll actually see the product. It's that can you see the line of sight in terms of the value of what you're doing.
But isn't the value of what you're doing reflected ultimately in the outcome? And if you don't see yourself in the outcome, if you're the drafter of a briefing note that goes up to then 4 or 5 other layers, and ultimately what goes to the minister bears no resemblance to what you wrote, how do you maintain any personal meaning in that? Because effectively it's been negated, hasn't it? That others have kind of ignored your meaning or not felt it worthwhile, and as a result, you feel like you don't have any meaning.
Yeah, that's the great challenge. And the more complex the organization is, the more
Well, that's why I say, isn't it a systemic issue then in big organizations that there really is no solution to that?
It's more of a challenge, but I think there's things that you can do to move in a positive direction. It's more of a journey than a destination. We'll never wrestle it down in large, complex organizations.
Okay, Claire and folks in Auckland, I don't know if we came anywhere close to what you raised, and I apologize if we didn't. Frankly, I was having trouble hearing. You were coming through, but it was a little bit difficult to hear. So I apologize if we were totally off the mark.
No, that picked up some of our points. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So, well, maybe now we'll go over to Western University of Western Ontario. Lynn, are you there? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I'm here.
Okay. Any thoughts from your perspective?
We actually have two people that have questions, so I'm going to pass it to them. Do you want to go first?
Sure. In large organizations where the nature of work is considered dangerous, say like the RCMP or the military or even kind of firefighters, I was just wondering, the product and the description of the work is pretty regimented. It's very structured. It's very defined, obviously, for operational effectiveness and overall safety. And line of sight that you spoke about before is pretty obvious. In those industries, there's a lot of ill and injured personnel, and they're very unmotivated. I've encountered a number of them. So they're very disengaged in their work, like you described before. How would you suggest that in an organization such as this, where job descriptions and outcomes have to be done for safety reasons, how do you see your concept fitting in with that kind of organization?
Go ahead now.
Okay. It's true. There are organizations where the work and the roles have to be very structured, very regimented, because there are because the outcomes can be critical. And but once again, I think it goes back to the line of sight, to the larger why question. And I think that can help. It can help if it's strong. It can help me to accept the regimentation of the role. So if I believe in the why of being a firefighter, because it's helping to save people's lives and property, if I keep my line of sight there, it can help me to accept why I need to do that in a regimented way, in a way I'm being trained into, so that I can do it well. So I think in the end, the ultimate why of what I'm doing and what kind of contribution it's making to my world, I think becomes the umbrella that can help me to reconcile that I haven't defined my particular job.
And maybe if I can just add to that, I think sometimes when people disengage, it is a survival mechanism, meaning that while they can competently carry out the tasks of the job, there may be a threat to the self in that, because when you have people dealing with potentially dangerous situations, like you've called them, maybe they need to disengage to do that. And I would think that if I were working in those kinds of areas or talking to people that have disengaged themselves, I would want to first find out if that may have been perhaps one of the issues that they're grappling with, and talk about appropriate coaching and mediating, because I think that sometimes people come into these occupations with a very strong moral suasion about what they want to do and why they're doing it, and soon find themselves perhaps being faced with some of the realities that they get faced with in their work. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm seeing, yeah, it is, thank you.
Okay. Lisa?
Okay, can you hear me? Or do I have to press anything? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, we're starting to be interested in the reasons that people with disabilities have so much difficulty becoming employed, and finding that many employers intrinsically object to paying for the costs of accommodations and developing strategies to accommodate people with disabilities. So I was really wondering whether you feel that any of your ideas might apply. Are there ways to motivate employers to find meaning in engaging with people who have disabilities and incorporating them in their organizations? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We actually have been working on an entire presentation that we're doing a workshop in June on that very item. And what we've done is come up with sort of a model that will look at 3 different levels of intervention, if you want to call that, into an organization. The top being at the organizational level and working with the senior officials of an organization and talking about some of the social, cultural things that are there. And we've identified, I think, 3 principles in there that we would want to work with. And then we've gone down to the second level, which is at a work unit level, and what needs to happen at a work unit, meaning that's where the person with the disability would go. And again, I think we've come up with 3 principles that we would want to instill in organizations. And then lastly is to try and change the language around disability management at an individual level and move away from concepts of caseloads and even some of the more conventional terms in job carving and those sorts of things. And so we've developed a model there where we've actually designed sort of 2 principles to follow on that. So more than happy to share that with you if you like.
And another consideration for employers is the discretionary effort that comes from engagement, and particularly people being able to bring their passion to their work. If I'm taking if I'm focusing on putting people to work at what they can do, and so taking a deficit attitude towards the disability, I'm going to see it as cumbersome as a problem. But if I take if I'm thinking about engaging people and I take an enablement approach to connecting people with what they can do, and thereby releasing some discretionary effort, that's a reality that employers can change the conversation about accommodation.
And the HRSDC has actually done some good work on that, having just released a report led by a national employer group. Again, more than happy to send you some of that information.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else at Western?
That's all.
No? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, maybe we'll go to Sue and the folks at UBC for comments, questions, observations.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Ken and Reg, I just wanted to say thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting to see how you knitted together organizational behavior development ideals with occupational science concepts. And I think the development of this kind of work is a lovely model across interdisciplinary work that can cross-fertilize the way we think. Indeed, even the way you use language and define terms is enlightening to look at how narrowly that we as an occupational science community might define something as compared to an organizational behavior development community. So I thank you for that. I'd like to start, Melinda, who's joined us here, Melinda Sudo, Dr. Sudo has some questions.
Okay, I would also echo Sue's appreciation for starting this dialogue. I really think it's a great dialogue, and I'm fabulously happy that we could have it internationally. I do appreciate Claire's comment about those of us in the university being almost one step before that 3-person or 3-stonecutter metaphor. And I also appreciate the ideas that coming from Western about the concern that we have about employers not taking a strengths-based approach. And I think I'll just make one comment about that, is I think that's where there's some potential for unions to work with unions and professional associations to help employers see that a strengths-based approach to people with disabilities and abilities could actually benefit both parties. And I really appreciate the idea of engaging people first. It's sort of like building something from the ground up. As we often do in qualitative research. So my one other comment that I wanted to raise is early on in your presentation, Reg talked about occupation being the doing, being, and becoming. And I think the one part that we may want to also consider there is the work that Karen Hamill and others have been doing, exploring the idea of belonging because I think belonging is a key part to the ideas that you're presenting here, and to people feeling engaged, is having that sense of belonging or growing that sense of belonging.
I thank you very much for that, because I think that is an excellent point.
Did you have anything you want to add? No.
I've made a number of notes from your presentation, and one of the things I wanted to talk about is what I think you're trying to move towards or are suggesting is that there's got to be some transition in organizations to move from perhaps a top-down approach, or one that silences employees at various levels such that they become disengaged, to transitioning to an organization or transitioning their cultural practices to be either more inclusive, more engaging, more empowering. And I'm very interested in transition work, and would just like to get your thoughts or ideas on how you would suggest that sort of a transition in a corporate culture to emerge, albeit I don't know that it can be immediate, but even over time in terms of its cultural practices.
Studies have shown that 70% of the influence on corporate culture tends to come from leadership. And I think sort of culture cascades primarily. And so I think the place to start is around forming our leaders, and forming our leaders' appreciation of the power of personal meaning. And I think I would say that's where it starts.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe to, Sue, when we talk about what kinds of activities do organizations engage in to have cultural conversations, I think probably some of those need to perhaps change themselves, because I think in the process of achieving what Ken is achieving, again, it's leaders are just as likely to lose the line of sight as is the employee on the front line. And it's to re-engage people actively with each other. And so in that process of having cultural conversations in organizations, it's about creating meaningful places where people can talk. And I do think sometimes in large bureaucratic organizations, we tend to want to have culture surveys to give us a voice to the employee, and maybe that's important to get that aggregate perspective. But there needs to be a dialogue between employees and management as well, Ken.
Yeah, no, it's true. If we can get organizational leaders and prospective leaders to explore and appreciate and feel the difference that connecting with their personal sense of meaning makes to them, then that should help to translate that into their leadership practices.
I think the whole notion of giving voice really resonates with me, in that I think that's not a small thing to do. It's sometimes very difficult. I'm reminded of a story about garbage collectors in a municipality where they were having to they couldn't afford new trucks, and they had fewer and fewer trucks on the road, and they weren't being able to collect the garbage as quickly as they needed to, but they didn't have the funds to repair these trucks. And it became quite stressful in the community, and the leadership was having increasing difficulty on how to manage it. And almost in a fit of exacerbation over this whole situation, they asked actually the garbage collectors, how do you think you could be more efficient? And this one guy said, well, I have an idea. I pick up a garbage can and I throw the garbage in, but while I'm throwing the garbage in, the truck could be going forward to the next property. I could put the garbage can down on the next property, pick up the garbage can, throw it in. He could be driving forward, and I'd keep dropping it off so that, in fact, the garbage cans are rotating around the neighborhood, because it doesn't really matter who owns the garbage cans. It just has to be a vessel to collect the garbage. And it is a wonderful example, I think, of asking those people that are on the ground for a solution that is very viable. And of course, in that particular situation, it actually solved the problem, because they were actually able to increase their efficiency about 35%, which made the difference. And in terms of their issue of being able to collect the correct volume or the needed volume of garbage. And I think that there's not enough. That's just one example of how we shift cultural practices where we actually allow people to express their opinion and to influence how their work is carried out. And I wonder if that kind of control over quality of work or decision making or work processes are not exercised enough in organizations to facilitate that kind of understanding or enhancing meaning.
Good story, especially when you consider that there was a practical problem solved, but you can imagine what that situation may have done for that worker getting up in the morning, you know, with their contribution to making it work well, you know, having been taken up.
Thank you.
Okay, no other questions from UBC?
Not at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Actually, to your last point, Sue, it reminds me of the Lean Initiative, in a sense, which is fairly high profile here in this province and quite controversial, actually. But that's about changing values and culture in organizations by allowing people sort of at the working level to have input into these kinds of processes. So it's kind of timely from our perspective. And now maybe we'll go to Jen at the University of Saskatchewan for observations and comments from folks there. Jen?
Hi.
U of S?
I'm here. Can everyone hear me? So thanks for the presentation. I think we have a couple of people with questions. I just have one quick one to start, which is regarding the statistics you presented at the very beginning of your presentation. You seem to be suggesting that there was quite a notable increase in levels of disengagement, but we didn't see numbers from before, and I'm wondering if you know what the levels of disengagement in the workplace were prior to the years that you collected your data.
I don't have the numbers, but both the Aon Hewitt and the Connexa Institute studies, the conclusion out of those studies was that 2011 marked a low year in levels of engagement. So I don't have the numbers that they base it on with me, but I'm just referencing the conclusion of their study.
Okay, and your comment suggested that the recession was at least in part to blame for the drop in levels of engagement, and that is...
Actually, I guess what I was saying was that, you know, sort of as you move beyond 2008, it's more difficult to attribute disengagement to that disruptive event, and that if engagement is remaining flat even into 2013, it's too easy to just attribute it to an economic disruption.
Okay, so one other question related to that then. I've worked for the past 20 years in the arts, in not-for-profit organizations, and in the public sector arts organizations, and those are places where there is a very strong sense of vocation for most employees. It's really easy to find a sense of purpose and passion in work, but at the same time, I've seen how employee engagement can plummet depending on management style. And so for me, this idea of participatory management is key in terms of successfully engaging staff in the workplace. I know that in the arts and in other not-for-profit areas, but particularly the arts, we have been struggling with how to respond to the new public management style of accountability demanded of arts organizations by public funders. So I'm wondering if you could quickly comment on the relationship between new public management, employee engagement, all of these things that we've been discussing today.
I think you've sort of demonstrated that engagement may have more to do with the philosophy and culture of that drives the organization than external circumstances. So I kind of go back to your words, and I think that you put it very well. I'm not sure I answered that, but
if I can maybe add to that, if you're talking about sort of the NPM and the metrics required, some of the issues that arrive when you talk about the arts is how does the private value of people working in those organizations meet with the public value and the perceived public value of those that are in the public funders or organizations? Because I think the issue is it's a requirement of an accountability that is perhaps different, so that the metrics required aren't necessarily ones that will uphold the value of the arts.
Exactly. Thank you. Very well put.
Right? That's where I'm saying, and I think that, again, the issue of private value and public value has not been aligned.
So I guess what I'm suggesting is that I see the potential for different management needs and styles to clash, and that there's some issues to be resolved then if we're going to make this work in a real workplace in some areas.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. My colleague here has a question as well.
Thank you for the time, and I have two questions that I would like to know more about it. One is somehow related with the garbage can example that is given from the UBC, and I appreciate that. So with the work that is being done by the organizations that are working for the common good, like the newcomer organizations in Saskatoon or Regina, they are assisting the newcomers. But they have a different management whereby they compete for funding from the government, and therefore they have to work in isolation in a way that they are giving the same services, but they are not collaborating with other agencies that are giving the same services. In that environment, therefore, how does the meaning or the power of meaning affect the delivery of services?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand totally the question, but let me try to answer it. And I think, again, I think when I look at those organizations, the newcomer organizations, there is a contractual relationship, if you want to put it that way, between the funder and the newcomer organization. And if your question is about how do you align the meaning between that funder and the organization, it has to do with the nature of the contractual relationship. And I think that there are discussions, again, about, to go back to the question on the arts, what are the metrics? What are the values that are behind what is expected of attaining that funding? And I think there needs to be some alignment between what the organization wants and what the funder expects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. The expectations of the funder and the needs of the organizations are very critical in the question. Therefore, the needs of the clients seem to be ignored in that. And I was wondering, there are now three parties, the funder, the organization, and the clients, that are also having a different meaning. And I was wondering, how do we align all these differences?
Well, I would hope that in that case, the needs of the client are actually the common purpose that help the goals of the funding organization and the goals of the agency to align. That it's actually the needs of the client that brings it together.
And therefore, they have the same meaning as the agency and the funder. Is that the assumption we are making, though?
Well, I would hope that
Clients.
the contractual arrangement is there, hopefully, because the funding organization has a goal that's focused on the client need, and the agency is an appropriate deliverer of the solution to those needs, and that's what hopefully brings that alignment.
And I think where you test out if that alignment is there is by ensuring that when that relationship begins that you agree on, how will we know if we are actually realizing the common purpose, which is to meet the needs of the client. That is to engage in a proper evaluation framework, because I think that's where you want to ensure that the clients have voice.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
I think we're done here. Thank you.
Okay, well, maybe I'll ask people we have here in Regina if there are any questions, comments, or observations you want to make.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It was excellent. I took tons of notes. I loved your slide on how we're killing meaning. I thought that was fantastic. And I'm a Jim Collins fan too, so I'm just wondering if you can comment on thoughts you have on his concept of the proverbial bus and getting the right people on the bus, the right people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats on the bus. That wasn't one of the things that you'd considered in your response as to how we're killing meaning, but it seems one that would draw naturally from some of the challenges we're facing in, say, a large organization.
Well, I think culture cascades, and it's about leadership. And so, I mean, Collins will say that you start by getting the right people, right? You don't build the organization and mold people in it. You bring the right people to the organization, which kind of echoes our, if you want a good, strong common meaning, you bring the right personal meaning to inform it. So it comes back to having the right leaders in place, having the right people on the bus.
Any other questions here? Oh, okay, here we go.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the statistics about lack of engagement and active disengagement at the beginning of your presentation as well. You started off very early by saying that you were going to talk about meaning and purpose, and you were going to exclude making a living. And I understand, I think, why you did that for the purposes of the discussion. But that's a pretty arbitrary boundary. And I think making a living, supporting one's family, planning for the future, those kinds of things are an important part of the ecosystem in which most people work. There was a thing in the Globe and Mail this morning, yet another set of statistics showing that it's only the very highest income earners that are realizing gains in income, that the rest of us are staying flat and have done for some time. And I wonder if all the things you talked about line of sight and creating meaning and shared meaning and connecting private and public meaning, might be more easily realized if people felt that they also, as a result of their efforts, were going to get ahead. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, we did arbitrarily park a part of the consideration for why we work so that we could explore this other, and actually thank you for bringing it back. It's part of the reality. And you're right that getting ahead in terms of my standard of living, can be a very important part of my personal meaning. So, thank you.
And there is a balance in there. because I do think that there will be times when, because it works at the opposite, that when you have people that are so driven to earn and have long passed sort of the threshold, that becomes prime, and so it all mixes together, and I agree with you. I think, but it's at a whole series of it's on a continuum. If that makes any sense, right? So it's not. I don't think we're dealing just with people who are fighting to meet the bare essentials of life. It goes all the way up, and in fact, would also say that it's as much an issue when people have lost the personal meaning of work and strictly do it for the extrinsic rewards as well.
Okay, we're fast running out of time here. No more questions here in Regina. So I guess we should talk, and I don't know, about next steps. Are there next steps that come as a result of our discussion today?
Yeah, this came out of a conversation between Reg and I, and so we thought we would kind of bring our conversation out and see if there was some energy for a larger conversation on what we've been exploring. And so that's kind of what we're interested in, is how this has, how people have reacted to this, whether there's more that we should run with here.
Any thoughts on that from the different locations? So what's the outcome of this? Are there next steps that we should consider? Another conversation, a bigger conversation, more focused?
From Western?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Lynn Shaw, and I think that there is a need for a bigger conversation, especially within occupational science, to really develop more interdisciplinary perspectives with regards to the whole issue of looking at meaning in work and in organizations and how to bridge that. So I think that a way forward out of this might be to start thinking about bridging some of the education and learning materials between the two areas, two disciplines, bringing those together. So I think that might be one area to start, and maybe using some critical examples and looking at how the two areas can actually get to that practical solution at the end that you talked about. Because I think right now there was so much information at the beginning that I think we need time to sort of understand it, especially in the complexities of a public sector, private sector relationships and clients, because I think that's a really big area, that the complexity of that in and of itself, and how these ideas can help organizations and people who work in those organizations to really get at meaning. And I can say on a personal level, I have not been asked about what's meaningful to me, and that's kind of sad when I work in an area where meaning is an essential component of what we do. So not being asked from an organizational perspective is a problem. I mean, I'm okay as an individual. I know what's meaningful to me. But when you think about it, if we don't even have practices in place in our organizations where that question is raised, then we have a long way to go to actually engage others in other organizations and suggest an example and lead by example. So I think as a discipline, we need to be leading by example and putting information forward, and then getting to that practical application, because we need to do it well.
Okay. Anybody else on the other?
Conference would have been good, but it's a bit late for that. Maybe the next conference.
Sorry, is there anybody else?
It's UBC.
Well, go ahead.
Do you want to say something?
Oh, the only thing I can think of in the short term is trying to put in some submission to an occupational science conference or an organizational development conference to have a roundtable or a workshop or something that really does bring together the two disciplines, because I think further dialogue is necessary.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. Now, maybe the simplest thing to do is if the moderators could send in, I mean, everybody's connected by email, right? They have and read your emails. Maybe comments from your individual groups, your thoughts, just send them into Ken and Reg, and we'll assign you guys as being the pivot for this, maybe, to kind of amalgamate this thinking and then maybe follow up with, okay, so what about a conference on this and bringing the people together and you know, we could sort of move the yardsticks in that sense. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, and the other thing is your presentation is available, right? If people, if they don't have it, they certainly can get your presentation to sort of as food for thought if people want to go through it. So they should just contact you guys directly?
$9.95 and we'll send a T-shirt.
Oh, okay, all right, a T-shirt too.
I think it'll be on the Johnson-Shoyama site, I think.
It'll be on the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy site at the University of Regina. So anyway, University of Saskatchewan. All right, well, I think that I know people have to run here very quickly. I want to thank everybody for taking part. I know folks in Auckland had to get up. I think it was really early in the morning for you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and our other locations as well, and everybody in the room. And to Reg and Ken, thank you very much for what was a great presentation, very stimulating discussion. And now that we've sort of connected a network on the subject, hopefully we can keep some momentum behind this. So thanks again, everybody, for taking part today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So I guess, yeah, out of the TV.